Hello, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 581. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, including the Ned's military aid package to Ukraine and some updates on the Israel onslaught in Gaza. So, if you want to share the show, it's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at _KyleAnzalone_. Best place to keep up with all of my work. Not only do I produce this show, but I write articles almost every day of the week on, news stuff dealing with American wars abroad. Last thing to mention before we get into the episode today, check out my appearances this week. I was on Run Your Mouth. That is the great Robbie the Fire Bernstein's news comedy show. He brings me on to occasionally to talk about some more serious issues. And so I had a good time chatting with Robbie, and we talked about the Iran-Israel relationship and exactly what's going on there. And then also I will be on Judge Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom, today. That is April 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you can, tune in live. If not, make sure you catch at least my appearance on Naps. All right, let's get into it. CIA director claims lawsuit against alleged CIA-backed spying on Assange visitors could damage U.S. security. This is from Kevin Gosztola at The Dissenter. So, CIA Director William Burns claimed that a lawsuit involving alleged spying on Americans who visited WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange must be dismissed, or there could be, quote, serious and exceptionally grave damage to the national security of the United States. In a declaration that involves the state secret privileges, Burns also maintained that the CIA would not provide any explanation in open court for why the agency believes damage could occur if the lawsuit proceeds. The complete factual basis for my privilege assertion cannot be set forth on public record without confirming or denying whether the CIA has information related to this matter and therefore risking the very harm to the United States national security that I seek to protect, Burns added. So he says, I can't even tell you why. I can't tell you, or we can't get into this because that itself would violate the state secret privileges. So absolutely absurd. And, this state secret privilege has been used and abused. And in fact, the first time it was invoked was when a bomber crashed. And actually years later, it turned out that the state secret privilege was invoked essentially for corrupt reasons to protect the government and companies who are engaged in malfeasance. So 4 Americans, 2 attorneys, and 2 journalists alleged that the CIA and CIA Director Mike Pompeo directed UC Global, a Spanish security company, to carry out a spying operation against Assange that violated their privacy. UC Global allegedly copied the contents of their electronic devices and provided the data to the CIA. In December, U.S. Judge John Kotel dismissed multiple claims that were filed against the CIA, but Kotel also determined that Americans had grounds to sue the CIA for violating their reasonable expectation to privacy under the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. A prior decision in Amnesty versus Clapper, which challenged the legality of bulk telephone metadata collection program operated by the CIA, helped the judge determine that allegedly targeting Americans had standing to sue the CIA. The judge's statement said, if the government's search of their conversations and electronic devices and seizure of the contents of their electronic devices were unlawful, the plaintiffs have suffered a concrete and particularly injury fairly traceable to the challenged program and redressable by a favorable ruling. Not long after the judge determined that Americans had standing to sue the CIA, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams and Assistant U.S. Attorney John David Barnea notified the court that the CIA would assert state secret privileges to blot the lawsuit. Richard Roth, an attorney for the allegedly targeted Americans, said, we find it extremely disheartening that the CIA refuses to even file an answer to the complaint. Instead, it chooses to hide behind the state secret privilege when it is indisputable that our clients have nothing to do with any investigation by the CIA or a government agency. The Americans who sued the CIA are Margaret Kutzler, a civil rights activist and human rights attorney, Deborah Harbrick, a media lawyer who represented Assange, John Goetz, a journalist who worked for a German outlet, and Charles Glass, who wrote articles on Assange for The Intercept. The CIA's position raises one logistical question. If there were truly no facts to support the allegations in the complaint, why can't the CIA simply deny each of them? The lawyer for the plaintiffs added. Burns submitted a classified declaration that only the judge may read. As Burns stated, that declaration fully defines the scope of the information at issue and explains the harm that could be expected to result from the unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Roth called it patently unfair and unjust and impossible for the plaintiffs to oppose the secret motion submitted by the CIA exclusively to the court that neither the plaintiffs nor their counsel may even be allowed to read. Despite the rigorous process that would undoubtedly take into account national security interests, Burns essentially equated the sharing of documents through discovery to national security leak. Note that the Classified Information Procedures Act is law that applies to the criminal prosecutions. However, that does not mean that courts cannot adopt their own procedures for a civilian lawsuit. The state secrets privilege is rooted in a 1953 case known as United States versus Reynolds, where the U.S. government refused to tell victims' families how their loved ones had died in a military plane crash because they contended secrets would be revealed. Decades later, declassified Air Force documents led victims' families to sue the U.S. government, and the families alleged the government concealed its fraud for decades, holding the accident reports and witness statements as classified materials into the 1990s, even though they could say no secrets and no conceivable further utility. Indeed, that was the Air Force's purpose in classifying them, to bury them so deep and so long that no one would find them. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2005 that the government had not committed fraud, even as the court's recognition of a lack of sensitive information in the accident's investigative report and witness statements. Particularly under the global war on terrorism, the U.S. Justice Department has allowed agencies like the CIA to invoke the privilege so that cases involving human rights abuses and civil liberties violations may be dismissed. So Richard Roth, the attorneys, told the dissenter in February, from our vantage point, we cannot imagine how there is any privilege at all that relates to the proprietary information of American citizens who visited the Ecuadorian embassy. Additionally, Burns contends that the CIA Act exempts the CIA from publishing or disclosing the organization's functions, names, title, official titles, salaries, or numbers of personnel employed by the CIA. The CIA Act is a law passed in 1949 and has been wielded by the agency to prevent disclosure of records under the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. It would appear that Burns asserted this statutory privilege if the judge does not conclude that the information related to the copying of Americans' data, electronic data, involves state secrets. So this is kind of their backup plan, and just, gross abuses of the power of the CIA here. And, the U.S. intelligence agencies are only gaining more and more power. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, April 21st. Biden signs bill into law extending warrantless spying powers. On Saturday, President Biden signed a bill into law extending Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which gives the federal government the power to spy on Americans without a warrant. The Senate passed Section 702 extension at 11:45 p.m. on Friday night, 15 minutes before the spy tool was due to expire. The legislation President Biden signed into law extends Section 702 until April of 2026. And I think something worth noting, in the intelligence community has been pretty clear about this. While they place all this pressure on Congress and say, if you don't pass this by the deadline, Americans are going to start dying because we won't be able to do our jobs of defending the American people. In reality, they have explained, and even the Wall Street Journal has reported this, that even if Congress didn't authorize it or chose to shut this program off, it would take about a year for them to actually unwind and stop collecting data. They have multiple authorities that they use, and they think it would be a real battle that took time to basically prevent the government from spying on us. So the bill passed through the Senate in a vote of 60 to 34, with 17 Democrats, 16 Republicans, and 1 independent voting against the spying powers. Earlier this week, the legislation passed the House in a vote of 273 to 147. Section 702 gives the federal government the ability to spy on Americans by allowing warrantless surveillance of foreign citizens and any U.S. citizen they communicate with. The surveillance allows the collection of emails, texts, and other types of digital communications. And I was thinking about this a little bit, and when this bill was initially passed in the wake of 2001, the idea that you are conversating with a foreign person wasn't necessarily something that a lot of people did. I mean, sure, there are a lot of immigrants in America, and they do, talk to their families outside the country. But when I was a kid, I remember that international calling was maybe not prohibitively expensive, but was expensive enough that it was made a luxury that people just didn't, call up people from other countries. There had to be, some more thought behind it. But now, not only can you basically pick up your phone and call anybody in any country that you want, oftentimes with, little or no additional charges, certainly very manageable charges if you get them. There is Facebook, Twitter, email. And so, somebody from Twitter could message me and ask me a question. I have no idea what country they're from, right? The CIA, the NSA, they probably know where every single communication is going to and from. And so, if one of my buddies, is in on a trip somewhere, anywhere, or, somebody who I talk to just about my job and what I think about the world, maybe they're traveling to a foreign country and I want to talk to them. Somebody like, Matt Ho, who's traveling overseas right now, who I recently talked to. Now, if we're having conversations, and of course, when other people that talk to people overseas and then you talk to them, you're probably going to get picked up in the surveillance too. And so there's a lot here that makes this incredibly intrusive. All right. Want to mention this one. Dave DeCamp wrote it up for antiwar.com last week, and I just didn't have a chance to get to it. And this is a little bit good news. New Hampshire GOP adds Defend the Guard to party platform. And we talked about Defend the Guard a lot on the show and how important this is. With a resounding aye, Defend the Guard was made an official part of the New Hampshire Republican Party platform. On Saturday, April 13th, the New Hampshire GOP held a meeting to vote on a platform amendments. Among the list of proposals was the following: demand that Congress exercise their sole ability over war declarations and protect the New Hampshire National Guard by requiring a congressional declaration of war prior to any National Guardsman deployment to an overseas combat zone. After some remarks from supporters and 1 or 2 in opposition, it went to a voice vote, and the ayes had it by a large margin. This means that Defend the Guard legislation is now an official plank of the Republican New Hampshire Party platform, located under the federalism section of the state party website. The platform can be read, and there's a link in the article here. So this is a pretty big victory for Defend the Guard. It's probably going to make it more of a priority for Republicans in New Hampshire, and maybe even, something that we could see get passed. I think this puts New Hampshire maybe as now the most likely state to get this legislation passed. All right, moving on to the war in Ukraine. U.S. planning larger than normal weapons package for Ukraine that will include some armored vehicles. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, April 22nd. U.S. officials told Politico that the Biden administration is preparing a, quote, larger than normal weapons package for Ukraine that will include armored vehicles and arms to support Ukraine's artillery and air defense capabilities. The package is expected to include Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvees, M11-3 armored personnel carriers, and missiles. The Pentagon wants the military equipment to be ready to go once President Biden signs the law authorizing $61 billion in spending for the proxy war. The House passed the new Ukraine aid over the weekend, along with other military aid for Israel and Taiwan. The 3 military bills will be rolled into one $95 billion spending package for the Senate, and it is expected to hold that vote today on Tuesday. Biden spoke with Ukrainian President Zelensky on Monday and said he would sign the bill into law once it reaches his desk. The White House said in a readout of the call, President Biden shared that his administration will quickly provide significant new security assurance package to meet Ukraine's urgent battlefield and air defense needs as soon as the Senate passes the National Security Supplemental and he signs it into law. Officials said that the first arms package using the $61 billion will be significantly larger than most of the previous U.S. weapons package for Ukraine, which was worth over $300 million. The U.S. has previously provided Ukraine with arms packages that were over $1 billion. I do expect this one to be in the billions of dollars, $2, $3, $4 billion maybe. And some of these weapons may already be in Poland. I saw some pictures, and when something's on ads, it could be sometimes hard to confirm, but it did appear that there is a significant number of U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles already in Poland. And so it could be that the U.S. is trying to move the weapons in place now, assuming that the Senate is going to pass this law and then be able to have them in Ukraine within days, hours, weeks at the most, if the Senate goes through and passes this, which everybody expects them to. I'm not sure why they actually haven't voted on it yet, but as we said, we expect that vote today. Zelensky said on Monday night that the new bill stipulates Ukraine will receive Army tactical missile systems, ATACMS, that have a range of about 190 miles. The U.S. secretly armed Ukraine with older cluster variant of the ATACMS that can hit targets up to 100 miles away, but hasn't sent the newer version. And a part of that was the U.S., or at least the Pentagon, was saying that they didn't have enough ATACMS of the longer range variant to send any to Ukraine. In an agreement on ATACMS for Ukraine, all details are in place. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Congress. Thank you, America. Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, said on Sunday that the U.S. could ship ATACMS as soon as next week. The provision of ATACMS will mark a significant escalation since the missiles have a longer range than anything the U.S. has provided. Now, France and I believe the UK have both provided the Storm Shadow missiles, which I think have a range of between 150 and 200 miles. So I'm not sure if this is going to be the longest range weapon that the West has sent Ukraine. The new U.S. aid for Ukraine will ensure the war continues, but is not expected to make much of a difference as Kiev is suffering a serious manpower shortage. Russia has also been making steady gains for months now and has stepped up missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure in response to attacks on Russia. All right, next up is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 22nd. Polish president says country is willing to host NATO nukes, so this is highly provocative. The leader of Poland said Warsaw is willing to host nuclear weapons from a NATO country in response to Russia moving strategic arms into Belarus. The Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, called the proposal absolutely massive. In an interview with a Polish tabloid, Polish President Duda expressed his willingness to host NATO nuclear weapons. I must admit that when asked about hosting nuclear weapons, I declare our readiness. Recently, Russia has been relocating its nuclear weapons to Belarus. If our allies decide to deploy nuclear weapons as a part of nuclear sharing, also on our territory to strengthen the security of NATO's eastern flank, we are ready for it. Duda went on to say he expects some but not universal access to the nuclear weapons if they are moved onto Polish territory. We don't have such a tradition. There has never been, unless my memory serves me wrong, such a complete universal access to weapons in Poland. We can discuss loosening some of the shackles of requirements in this area, but I would be cautious about completely universal access to weapons. So the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, appeared alarmed by the leader's remarks. He said, I would like any potential initiatives to be, first of all, very well prepared by the people responsible for them, and I would like all of us to be absolutely positive about what we want. This is absolutely massive, I would say, and very serious, and I would need to know all the circumstances that led the president to make this declaration. Now, in Poland, the president is the leader, and the prime minister is appointed by the president to work with the legislator to elect a list of ministers. And so I think there's supposed to be, and there's a reasonable expectation that the prime minister is going to be in the president's corner. So this, it was a very careful way that he worded it, but, expressing any concern from Polish ministers is interesting. The foreign affairs minister was also critical of Duda's proposal, saying this would be a very serious decision, all the circumstances of which should be discussed primarily in the Council of Ministers. So far, there have been no such decision at the Council of Ministers. Previously proposed by lower-level Polish officials, moving NATO nuclear weapons further east would likely be seen as highly provocative by Russia, especially as Poland hosts the Aegis Ashore missile defense system. While those launchers are ostensibly intended for air defense, the Aegis is also capable of firing nuclear-tipped Tomahawk cruise missiles for offensive operations. The Kremlin says the presence of Aegis systems in Poland and an additional battery in Romania present a strategic threat to Moscow. A Russian government spokesperson said the Kremlin would respond if NATO moved forward with Duda's proposal. So Peskov explained, the military will, of course, analyze the situation if such plans are implemented, and in any case will do everything necessary. We will take all necessary retaliatory steps to guarantee our safety. 3 members of NATO maintain nuclear arsenals, the US, UK, and France. Additionally, the US stores strategic weapons in Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, and has vowed to use its bombs to defend a long list of allies under Washington's nuclear umbrella. And so I think it's more likely than not, and probably, like we're talking in the 80 or 90% range here, that if these weapons get distributed, it would be American weapons going into Poland, not French or Brit. All right, next up here. President Biden smears pro-Palestinian protesters as anti-Semitic. And so Columbia University has had this camping. It's like a Gaza solidarity encampment. And my understanding is that this is a throwback, or from the students, they look at history of students at Columbia University, and during the Vietnam War there were these style encampments on the campus. So that seems to be what they're channeling. Now, on Monday, President Biden smeared protesters at college campuses around the country opposed to Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza as anti-Semitic. I condemn the anti-Semitic protests. That's why I've set up this program to deal with it, Biden told reporters. I condemn those who don't understand what's going on with the Palestinians. Biden's comments came as the media is focused on Columbia University in New York City, where students have set up a camp named the Gaza Solidarity Encampment. Some of the students involved in the protests were arrested last week and suspended by the university, prompting a walkout by faculty members who showed their support for the students. And the suspended students, I believe, included the child of Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman. And so, this is, I think the way this is being handled and talked about in the mainstream media is really interesting, especially if we remember 4 years ago. We're, a month and a half short now of the 4-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and the response to that. And it's really crazy, right? Where just, again, 4 years ago, the narrative is that Trump was this tyrant, that he's using the police to step on everybody's First Amendment rights. He's doing it because he's a bigot. And essentially here you have the same thing, but President Biden's in charge, and that whole narrative gets completely dropped. And the president's allowed to and supported in the media, and even in large extent the liberal media, when he makes these charges against the protesters. So New York City Mayor Eric Adams has also smeared the protesters as anti-Semitic, saying, I am horrified and disgusted with the anti-Semitism being spewed around the Columbia University campus. The demand of protesters is for Columbia University to divest from companies profiting from the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in the West Bank. Al Jazeera reported that the protest is being organized by the student-led coalition Columbia University Apartheid Divest which is CUAD, Students for Justice Palestine, and Jewish Voices for Peace. According to the website, the coalition includes 116 organizations. The situation at Columbia has led some members of Congress to call for the National Guard to break up the protests, including Senators Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley. Critics of the protests have accused the demonstrators of harassing Jewish students, which has been a common claim about recent college protests in general. Peter Beinart, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, made the point on X that Jews are usually overrepresented among the pro-Palestinian protesters at college campuses. Sometimes they're the largest identity group. Maybe folks calling for cracking down on protesters in the name of Jewish safety should consider their safety too. And so I guess I'll go ahead and say first that, of course, when you have college kids engaging in protest movements, they're going to say and do things that at times embarrass the movement, as well as even if their overall thing that they're doing is furthering the movement, bringing awareness and trying to make a good point. And so, yeah, just saying that these protesters aren't anti-Semitic isn't necessarily an endorsement of everything every one of these protesters at all these college campuses do. There's been a couple reports, and you could see the video, and again, it's always hard to confirm and know exactly who's saying what and everything. But I have seen a couple videos where there are legitimately pro-Hamas chants that do get said among these crowds and things like that. Now, I haven't seen anything where the safety of a Jewish student just in general is really in danger. And again, as Beinart points out, a lot of times these encampments are overrepresented by Jewish students. And so, if the people really in these encampments just have a problem with the Jews, they would probably have a problem with the Jews that are all around them, not the ones walking through the campus. And so, there seems to have been some exchanges of words and things like that, protesters and counter protesters. This has become pretty common in the U.S. to have maybe not clashes isn't the right word, but at least exchanges of unpleasant words between different groups of protesters and things like that. But again, I haven't seen anything to actually condemn these protests as anti-Semitic, and it seems largely just good pro-Palestinian protesting that's going on, and something that's really needed. All right, next up here, 300 bodies found in Gaza mass grave. CNN reports a mass grave with more than 300 bodies has been uncovered at a hospital in southern Gaza City at Khan Yunis, Gaza civil defense workers said, following the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the area earlier this month. The director of the civil defense in Khan Yunis told CNN that 35 bodies have been discovered at the Nasser medical complex on Tuesday, bringing the total to 310. He said some 73 of the bodies have been discovered on Monday. The head of the civil defense in Khan Yunis alleged that some of the bodies have been found with their hands and feet tied, and there were signs of field executions. We do not know if they were buried alive or executed. Most of the bodies are decomposed. And so I saw on Twitter that there were some people arguing that these mass graves that they're finding at Shifa, the Al Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis, are not really mass graves, but from the IDF, but rather they were, because the hospitals were besieged and people were dying inside the hospitals, they can't go to a cemetery, they can't go to a morgue to bury these people, and so they were burying them on the hospital grounds. And this is something that I have talked about on the show. This is definitely something that has happened. Now, what the Palestinians are saying, and what I believe, is they're not saying that every single body found in one of these mass graves is a result of an Israeli, killing somebody or an extrajudicial killing, but rather the Israelis also dumped bodies in mass graves on these hospital complexes. And so it's not necessarily to say that 300 people here were executed by the Israeli forces and thrown into these mass graves, but some number of them have been, and the Israelis contributed to those mass graves. And so I just want to, throw all that information out there. All right, next up here, Israel fails to back claims UNRWA tied to Hamas. So Middle East Eye reports, Israeli authorities have not provided any supporting evidence to back up allegations that the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugee Employees are members of groups that attacked Israel on October 7th. A group led by the former French Foreign Minister Kathleen Colonna has said. The report, which was commissioned by the UN, took a look at UNRWA's operation policies in the wake of Israel's allegations and was released on Monday. It said Israeli authorities have not responded to letters from UNRWA in March and April requesting names and evidence in order to open an investigation. The Israeli government, according to the independent review, has not informed UNRWA of any concrete concerns relating to UNRWA staff since 2011. And so the report, I went through and read it, and basically what it found was nothing to bat the main Israeli claims. They do say that, hey, we found some people who made social media posts that, weren't great. But at the same time, this is, something that happens when you have an organization of 30,000 employees. Some of them are going to post bad things online. This certainly doesn't condemn the overall organization, and they're pretty clear that these posts were marginal. They also said that there were some bots that were used that were not as neutral as the UN would like them to be, but this is far short of the Israeli claim that UNRWA is basically used by the Palestinians to indoctrinate an entire generation of Gazans to hate Israel. All right, next up here, an article from ProPublica. Israel attempts to prevent U.S. from blacklisting military unit that killed an American. So the report says Israel's leaders are fiercely pushing back against U.S. plans to withhold American assistance from an Israeli unit accused of human rights abuses. Axios and Israeli news outlets reported over the weekend that Secretary of State Antony Blinken intends to ban U.S. support for Israel's NATO Yehuda unit, the country's all-male ultra-Orthodox battalion, at the center of several controversies in the West Bank that goes back years. The battalion has been reportedly accused of shooting and insulting civilians, including in a 2022 case which several commanders handcuffed, gagged, and left for dead an elderly Palestinian American man in the West Bank. That, of course, was Omar Assad, who we talked about on the last show. So Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, posted on X, sanctions must not be imposed on Israeli defense forces. The intention to impose sanctions on an IDF unit is the highest absurdity and moral low. Blinken told reporters traveling with him in Europe on Saturday that he will make an official announcement about his decision in the coming days. According to Axios, that was expected on Monday and has not come yet. And so it seems to me that Israel is making some headway and pushing Americans not to put these sanctions on. The public dispute between Israel and the United States follows a ProPublica article on Wednesday that revealed Blinken had failed to act for months after the special State Department panel recommended that he disqualify multiple Israeli military and police units from receiving U.S. assistance after reviewing allegations they have committed flagrant violations, including extrajudicial killings and rape. Until now, the State Department has never disqualified an Israeli military unit from receiving aid, which could make Blinken's decision a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy. This is a very important law, he told reporters over the weekend, and it's one that we apply across the board. This is obviously not true, though. Israel even gets a special board within the State Department where they have an incredible amount of sway over what that board actually recommends. And it was even with that incredible amount of sway and really oversight of any conclusion that that board draws, that board actually recommended to Blinken these sanctions, even with Israel's significant say over what they produce. And so it just goes to show how significant the the Israeli abuses are and the need to recommend and change policy here. Of course, Israel is an apartheid state, and so its troops must enforce that apartheid system. And, that's what we're seeing here. I doubt the U.S. is going to do much. As ProPublica said in their initial support, Israel should be able to bypass these sanctions, especially if it's just on one battalion. But I think the fear in Israel is that this is going to set it up to do it more and more and more. And if you look, this report was issued in December, and it only looked at things going, back from October 7th. And so nothing that Israel has done in Gaza. And, day after day, we see these airstrikes that kill 10, 15, 18 children at a time. Absolutely horrific. All right, so Israel's military chief resigns over failure to prevent October 7th attack. The head of Israel's military intelligence announced his resignation on Monday, citing his failure to prevent the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel. "We did not live up to our mission. I bear full responsibility for the failure. The intelligence division did not live up to the task of ensuring we are entrusted with. Throughout my duties, I know that alongside my authority comes a heavy responsibility." He also called for the establishment of an investigative committee to investigate and find out through an in-depth and comprehensive and precise manner all the factors and circumstances. He is the first high-ranking Israeli official to resign, which came after 6 months of the Israeli relentless slaughter in Gaza and starvation of Palestinians in Gaza. According to an analysis from Haaretz, more Israeli officials are expected to resign. However, I'm not sure that Netanyahu is prepared to take responsibility and resign as well. And he certainly deserves it after his years of propping up Hamas. So Iran says nuclear weapons have no place in its nuclear doctrine. On Monday, the Iranian foreign minister reaffirmed Tehran is not seeking a nuclear bomb and that weapons have no place in Iran's nuclear doctrine. So the Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson said Iran has repeatedly said its nuclear program only serves peaceful purposes. Nuclear weapons have no place in our doctrine. His comments come after an Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps general suggested Iran could change its nuclear doctrine if Israel attacked Iran's nuclear facilities. Any decision to build a nuclear weapon would have to be made by Iranian supreme leader, who has issued a fatwa in 2003 bidding the production and any use of nuclear weapon or any use of weapons of mass destruction. The Islamic Republic's first supreme leader also prohibited the creation of any WMD program. The fact that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon was recently affirmed by the U.S. Annual Threat Assessment and the International Atomic Energy Association. Iran is currently not undertaking any key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device, the assessment says. Iran is reaching some uranium to 60%, which is the highest level it has ever attempted, but it is still lower than the 90% needed for weapons grade. Iran has increased its uranium enrichment since the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA in 2018 and in response to the Israeli covert attacks on its civilian nuclear program. So Iran uses its nuclear program to build negotiating leverage and respond to perceived international pressure. Tehran said it would restore JCPOA limits if the United States fulfilled its JCPOA commitments and the IAEA closed out its outstanding safeguards investigation, the threat assessment reads. And so it's quite amazing that the Biden administration could essentially at any time re-enter the JCPOA, but still goes about choosing not to, really reduce tensions in the Middle East and, give Iran skin in the Western game. And this is something that the West could even use as leverage over Iran to say preventing Iranian attacks on Israel. Now, Israel doesn't want this because they want the U.S. to go to war with Iran, right? That, you have the situation in the Middle East where Iran and Israel really can't go to war with each other because they would destroy each other's countries. However, Israel feels the U.S. could go to war with Iran, destroy Iran for Israel, and leave Israel, I would guess, relatively unscathed. I'm sure Israel does understand that some Iranian missiles would probably get through. The U.S. would probably Iran would probably target Israel fairly significantly if the U.S. went to war with Iran. I guess the Israelis would hope that the U.S. would resort to using nuclear weapons or something pretty early to prevent Iranian retaliation against Israel. All right, so next up here, this one from Will Porter: one killed in an explosion at Iraqi base. This was something that initially it gets reported and everybody makes a huge deal out of it. Oh my God, the Middle East is going to be on fire again. There was a major airstrike on a militant base in Iraq, and Will writes, one Iraqi militia fighter was killed and 8 others were injured after a large explosion rocked a military base south of Baghdad. Iraqi officials said both Israel and the U.S. denied involvement in the incident. The U.S. is usually pretty transparent when we bomb something in Iraq or Syria. That's not the case with Israel, but they usually don't deny it. They just don't say anything. The blast erupted early on Saturday at the base that is south of Baghdad. The military security media cell confirmed in a statement the explosion resulted in the martyrdom of a member of the Popular Mobilization Forces and the injury of 8 others, the statement said, noting that the wounded was a member of the Iraqi military. Previously serving as a U.S. forward operating base, the facility is now headquarters for the Iraqi Army and National Police Force, as well as the Popular Mobilization Forces, a network of Shia militias that operate as a quasi-official security force in coordination with Baghdad. And of course, the PMF was in part set up, organized by the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, and worked with the United States in defeating the Islamic State in Iraq. The cause of the explosion was initially unclear, but it now appears that it did not have anything to do with a drone aircraft and was just an explosion that occurred at a military base. Now, last up here today, U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria come under rocket and drone attack. So this seems like it could be pretty significant, or it could be something that we just move on from. So U.S. officials in Iraq and Syria came under separate rocket and drone attack in less than 24 hours, Reuters reported on Monday, citing U.S. and Iraqi officials. The officials said that the attacks were the first since the 3-month pause started in February. The Iraqi government and Iran has pressed Iraqi Shia militias to stop targeting U.S. bases after 3 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers were killed at Tower 22 in Jordan. A drone attack targeted the Adin al-Assad air base in western Iraq, and 5 rockets were fired at a base in a remote area of northeastern Syria. No casualties were reported in either attack, and so the U.S. could probably ignore this and maybe send some bad channel communications to Iran and say, hey, it would be really nice if you could keep these guys in line and prevent any attacks on U.S. bases. We don't want things to get out of hand again. And hopefully Iran would then send a letter out to these militias and say, knock it off. You don't want the Americans bombing your bases and carrying out major airstrikes and war in the Middle East. So we'll see what happens. Here, the other possibility is, of course, the U.S. bombs complete Hezbollah or another one, these Popular Mobilization Forces groups, and this sets off a massive, cycle of violence that the last one led to the death of 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan. Something very similar could happen this time. All right, everybody, that's what I got for you today. It does look like this is going to be another 5 episodes a week here at Conflicts of Interest. Dave DeCamp, Connor Freeman returning to the show later in the week, and I'll probably have another solo show out for you all tomorrow. Thank you so much, and don't forget to tune in today, Judging Freedom, 4 o'clock. I will be the guest.